Okay, I'm now going to present the final slides for the Week 2 lecture in GV467. You will recall we were talking about reactions to the intellectual collapse of modernization theory, and I suggested these were two. One was to try to adopt techniques from statistics or from the discipline of economics in order to reanimate comparative politics as a scientific project. A second way that scholars in comparative politics reacted to the collapse of modernization theory was to go back to the classics that had inspired modernization theory, but look at them in a different way. And the person who was most directly associated with this was Barrington Moore. Barrington Moore was a sociologist and political scientist and historian, taught at Harvard. He, as you can see from this quote, did not think much of Parsons and the other kinds and the kind of theory inspired by Talcott Parsons. Rather than looking for a maximally general theory of some sort of universal process of modernization, say one that took societies from one side of the pattern variable dichotomies to the other, Moore thought that one ought to look for distinct outcomes that arose via distinct historical pathways. In this sense, he was very similar to Weber, who, as we saw distinct pathways, for instance, to the building of the modern state. In Moore's magnum opus, The Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy, Lord and Peasant in the Making of the Modern World, Moore set out three different pathways according to which countries arrived at the modern world, dealt with the historical problems of state building and the emergence of the working class, also the emergence of international markets for agriculture. The key argument of this book is evident in its name. He thinks that dictatorship and democracy have social origins, and he's going to classify the key social actors as lords and peasants. So he's looking for social class explanations of the origins of dictatorship and democracy. The argument he comes up with is intricate, to say the least, and very difficult to summarize. I'm not going to try to reconstruct the whole argument here. This table, however, does attempt to summarize it and may give you some guidance when you encounter references to Barrington Moore in Theta Scotchbull. Probably the most famous statement from Moore's book is this one here: no bourgeoisie, no democracy. And what he believes is that in countries that remain heavily dominated by agriculture, and he has especially in mind Russia, but also China, there's no strong bourgeois class, no potential agent for a bourgeois revolution, and as a result, you don't get democracy. The bourgeoisie and a bourgeois revolution against monarchical rule are key to achieving democracy. Other than that, there are a number of different factors: relationship of the monarchy to the landed upper class, how the landed upper class deals with the arrival of international markets for agricultural produce, whether or not they react to it by trying to reinsert, or strengthen the insertment of the peasantry, and how successful that is. All of these things and a few other factors play into the individual outcomes. Scotchbull, who was a student of Moore and in many ways highly inspired by him, and you'll see that inspiration in the sections from the book you're reading, from Scotchbull's book you're reading, nonetheless felt that there were two key kinds of problems in Moore's account. One is an empirical problem that he focused largely on events within countries. Yes, he focused on the rise of international agricultural markets, but nonetheless he focused on within-country reactions. He ignored war, he ignored international pressure on later developing states. And Skocpol believes those things are very important to explaining revolutions in particular. Revolutions weren't the major dependent variable of Moore's book, but he had a lot to say about them along the way. Skocpol also had a methodological complaint, which you might understand thinking about the complexity of the previous slide. She thinks that the structure of reasoning is opaque. It's not just one difference or even a manageable number of differences between the cases that end up with democracy and those that end up with dictatorship that explain them. She wants a clearer structure of reasoning, and she proposes the use of small n comparisons, so comparisons of a small number of cases using the Millian logic of experiment that we talked about in last week's lecture. In addition to Skocpol, you'll be reading for this coming week a piece by Lieberson in which he critiques the use of Mill's methods for comparison. And I'll highlight two of the critiques he makes. One is that Mill's methods of comparison rely on a deterministic approach rather than a probabilistic one. So a deterministic approach says that things necessarily happen. So if you have international pressure, you necessarily have a revolution. That's just an example. It's not an argument anybody actually makes. As opposed to a probabilistic approach, which might say that sometimes in the presence of international pressure, one gets a revolution. So why doesn't the method of difference or the method of agreement work with probabilism? Well, suppose you're comparing two cases where international pressure was present in both cases, but in one case you had a revolution, in another case you didn't. You would say, oh, well, can't be international pressure because that was present in both cases, but you only had a revolution in one of them. But if there's a probabilistic relationship, so sometimes international pressure leads to revolution and sometimes it doesn't, the method of difference rules out a causal factor that's actually effective. A second important argument that Lieberson makes is that Mill's methods presume the existence of only one cause. Let's suppose, to explain how he makes this argument and why Mill's methods presume the existence of only one cause, let's suppose that it happens to be true of the world that an automobile accident can be caused by one of two things, either by speeding or by running a red light. And we have three cases, three data points, if you will. In two of them, an accident was the outcome. That was our dependent variables, accident or no accident. In one case caused by speeding, in one case caused by running a red light, and in the third case there's no accident at all, and neither of these factors are present. Well, now let's run a method of difference comparison of an accident case with a no accident case, and we see we have the speeding here and no speeding there, and that's the only difference between the two cases, so that must be the cause. According to the method of difference, speeding is the cause. Now we use our other accident case and we say, okay, here we have running the red light as the only difference between the two cases, so that must be the cause of accident rather than no accident. But if we look at all three together, what we see is that there is no single thing that's different across the cases of accident and no accident, so the method of difference just doesn't give us an answer. And Lieberson finds it implausible that the things we would care about explaining always only have the same kind of cause. Maybe you have different revolutions for different reasons. All right, so that pretty much wraps it up then. I just want to say by way of recap, here are a few things to look for in Skocpol. We talked today about the Marxist tradition and the Weberian one. How does she react to both of these? You'll have to look for signs of the Weberian tradition because she's largely implicit. Although it's very important to her, she doesn't spend a lot of time discussing Weber. How does she react to the modernization theory tradition, which she represents by the theorist of revolution Chalmers Johnson? And finally, as I suggested, one of the things that was really important to the field of comparative politics after the breakdown of modernization theory was how was scientific legitimacy going to be reestablished when this particular vocabulary, perhaps pretentious nonsense as Barrington Moore called it, but a vocabulary that seemed very scientific, had been overthrown. How is Scotchbull able to, and to what extent is she able to establish her scientific legitimacy? So those are some things to look for. Okay, that's it.